Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
All right, hello. It's me again, user SteelCan909, here today with a bit of a different and a bit of an unusual podcast guest for us to have here on the channel. And I'm going to not waste any time and go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Andrew Rakich. I am the creator of Atun-Shei Films, which is a YouTube channel where we kind of make like irreverent and cinematic videos about history. I'm best known for my stuff of my coverage of the American Civil War, namely a running series called Checkmate Lincolnites. But I do all sorts of shit, and I'm sorry, can I say shit?
I don't think anybody who's listening to this will be particularly offended, and if we need
Okay.
to, I can
All right.
add another.
I do all sorts of content about mainly focusing on American history, in particular with an emphasis in the colonial era. If I had to pick a single specialty, it would probably be 17th century New England. But I also have a great love of the history of my adopted hometown, New Orleans, especially the colonial history, and I'm also a filmmaker with a number of shorts and a couple features under my belt. I've got a feature film coming out within the next year or so. We'll see, called The Sudbury Devil, which I'm very excited about, and which will actually be good and not embarrassing.
Sounds great. So we are, like I said, you've come up on the Ask Historians subreddit several times. I know we've had several questions either about content that you've done or, asking us to fact check work that you've done. And really kind of what I wanted to start talking about was, where do you see yourself in the role as a public historical figure? Because, oftentimes, and you've been relatively clear about this in many of your videos, you are not a trained historian as far as I'm aware. That's correct?
That is correct. Yeah. No, I am not an academic. I do not have a history degree or any kind of historical background beyond experience from jobs. Yeah.
So, and I kind of wanted to ask, so how do you see yourself taking on this public historian role as somebody who is somewhat from the, excuse me, outside of the academic world, somewhat looking in, look on the periphery in a different medium than most academic historians or even people who are mostly just interested in history operate in?
Yeah. So, well, I think it just, I have a lot of experience just in public history, or at least in kind of like public facing history, sort of teaching history to people as a tour guide, namely, and as a documentarian. So basically, I've always been interested in history. I kind of fell into a job right after college where I worked for the Gettysburg National Military Park as a living historian, which was essentially kind of an acting gig. So you would basically deliver monologues as Civil War soldiers for the kiddies. And it was a great it was a great job and a really great group of people, and a lot of the park rangers at Gettysburg are people who have been trying to work there for their entire careers, and they're very good at what they do. And just the nature of being a park ranger. It's I think one of them put it that it was 80% bureaucrat, 20% historian. So it's not sort of a historian in the academic sense necessarily, but they took their jobs very seriously and they had a real love of what they did, and they had a real kind of rigor to the way that they taught history, which was a great exposure for me as somebody who had just sort of fallen into this and who was mainly coming things from the sort of the theatrical side or the artistic side of like, okay, well, I'm playing this character. And sort of talking to them, it became clear that there was a bit more of a responsibility for that, just like to have to find an authenticity within primary sources in order to make that character and that performance more real. You know what I mean? And also just to accomplish the point of the job, which is to educate people and to impart good information. And then after that, when I moved to New Orleans, I became a tour guide down here because that's just a very well-paying, easy job. for, it's kind of the best paying, easiest, best hour service industry job you can get in New Orleans. So that was sort of, I want that. And I did that for 4 years. New Orleans tour guides are pretty famously bad at history, or at least, are not opposed to bending the truth. Personally, I had a real ethical quandary about that. I did stuff like ghost tours or whatever, but mostly because I had to, because I had to eat. But ultimately, I kind of treated those more as sort of stand-up comedy, and the sort of supernatural elements I would not treat very seriously. And I made a pretty distinct, I made a distinction to my audiences between history and folklore, right? There was like the tone of the tour would shift definitively between the two. And the folklore was a lot more playful, a lot more fun. And then the history was a lot more straightforward. And then when I started doing YouTube, I kind of took those skills, which was kind of, having worked at Gettysburg, where you needed to hold the attention of whining children in the 100-degree heat, and then in New Orleans, where you have to deal with adults who are really drunk and acting like whining children in the 100-degree heat. It became, you really have to, you've got to give it jazz hands. You got to make it snazzy. You've got to make it entertaining for people if you're just going to hold their attention at all. And so that's a skill I had to learn real fucking quick. But also, there's a sort of on a deeper level than that. And it's something I think that a lot of historical educators maybe lack, is a connection to the humanity of history, of sort of history as gossip. You know what I mean? There's a humanity to history that often doesn't come through in kind of dry retellings and in dry studies. And that's not, and I don't want to sort of seem like I'm picking on academia here, because there's a lot of people who do what I do who also haven't learned that lesson. So a focus on the humanity, really kind of learned to really kind of put that front and center in my education. So when I started taking it to YouTube, I kind of took those skills to YouTube. And then when I started getting an audience, I immediately realized that I had a profound sense of responsibility because to make my information as up to date as possible. And so to that end, I kind of shifted focus from sort of history as gossip, or kind of like, something that was more kind of pop history, to more what I would describe as public history. It wasn't necessarily my research, academically speaking, that I was presenting. In fact, most of the time it wasn't. I've only kind of started, proffering my own theses and hypotheses very recently, in fact, and with only a handful of projects. For the most part, I'm kind of regurgitating academic consensus and trying to make it as up to date as possible. So I see it as being much more of a public history endeavor in that regard. And, and I know it's probably for a lot of your listeners and for a lot of academics, it's just a bare fucking minimum, but you'd be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't be shocked, how many people on YouTube just don't do this, which is just citing sources and just like having a little footnote that says, here's where I got this information. Like, that is so rare on the internet. I think people are getting better at that. I'd like to think I've been a sort of small part of that. But because I kind of very prominently started to do it.
I was going to say, was there a moment where you decided, I need to start adding in footnotes, or I need to start adding in some way that makes me look, or at least show that I'm being more responsible about my interaction with history with a more broad audience than what you might see in other YouTube, other popular historical outreach?
Yeah.
Was there a moment where you said, I need to start doing this?
Yeah, there was a moment. It was the fourth episode of Checkmate Lincolnites, which was, I had done 3 Checkmate Lincolnites episodes, and at that point, the series was not kind of what it became. Like right now, each episode is 30 minutes to an hour, and usually has some sort of short film at the end with insane production value, and this whole cinematic universe undercurrents going along with it, and it's this huge production. But back then, it was just 5 to 10 minute videos of just one tiny little topic that was not even explored in that great amount of depth. And basically I started hearing from a lot of people just who were just saying like, well, why should I believe you? You don't say where you got this information. And I thought that's a great point. And then I at the time when I was making that fourth episode, I was that's right before my channel blew up, when the sort of the first domino to fall algorithmically was that I got mentioned by a much bigger channel called the Cynical Historian, who is a proper historian, unlike me. It's this guy, Joe Patton Hall, who is in Albuquerque. Who's a was a historian of American violence and does some great work in that field. And so I sort of inspired a lot by his academic rigor, because again, I mean, I think him, maybe Stefan Milo, there's probably a couple others, but those are the two that I was aware of at the time. Only two history YouTubers were actually, that I was aware of, that I was watching, actually cited their sources and stuff. And a lot of the, especially the very big ones, the very prominent ones, the ones that everybody watched, just did not. And frankly, a lot of their conclusions were half baked at best. So I took a lot of inspiration from those guys, and then I think kind of again, I think maybe I was a small part of kind of getting that more sort of having source citing, and just and a little bit more sort of academic rigor in popular or public history on YouTube. I think kind of that's become much more of a thing now, and I think channels that don't do that are taken a lot less seriously, and I think that's probably a good thing. And again, I don't want to take all the credit, but I think I like to think, I hope that I played a small part in that.
So, given the changes that you mentioned in academic history on YouTube, like getting towards a more slightly rigorous format, or a more academically consistent approach, like with citation of sources, with using work that's come before, as you've been building kind of this para-historical, that's a weird way to phrase it, as you've been building this kind of extra academical, we'll call it that, source for historical information, how do you see YouTube, film, and other mediums changing to meet the way that history is changing? Because as we've seen in the past several decades, academic history is really in decline.
Yeah.
The number of new tenured professors is halving almost every year. New PhDs is cratering. Enrollment in courses is slowing down. How do you see these alternative sources to the dissemination of historical knowledge changing? Either, how they changed in the recent past. You mentioned that with your own approach towards citing. How do you see it changing in the future? Kind of, what are your thoughts on history outside of academia in your particular medium?
Yeah, well, I mean, I might be a little bit biased because it's kind of the sandbox that I play in, but I think it's critical. I think it's crucial. So I might be biased because this is the sandbox that I play in, but I think it's critical. I think it's crucial. I think YouTube is where people are looking for this information, and I think that if people who are interested in public education don't meet the public where they're at, then things will kind of keep going the way that they're going. And I think so. Yeah, I think it's kind of the front line in a lot of ways. I don't want to, because I've kind of been accused of this before, and I don't want to I don't want to seem like I'm bullying academics here, saying you should do this and wag my finger. I know that they're underpaid and they have their plates full already, and I'm not trying to scold them here, but I do think that that clearly the humanities are in decline. Clearly, just the level of education that specifically the American public has at large is catastrophically low. We see how history has been kind of weaponized in the culture war. I think that's a really good indication of how bad things have gotten in terms of just basic public understanding of a lot of historical issues. But yeah, I mean, I think it's not academia's fault. I think there's a lot of systemic problems that have kind of led to this. Generally, just a lack of money in crucial humanities fields, and also just an over reliance on STEM, and a realization by television networks like the History Channel that pseudoscience and pseudohistory is more profitable than actual science and actual history. So I think that's where kind of the blame lies. But I think academia And really anyone who, like myself, who's, maybe has a different skill set, like as a filmmaker or whatever, who actually cares about, giving about public education, is in the kind of unfortunate position where we might not have precipitated this crisis, but we're in it, and it's kind of up to us to step up to the plate and try to right the ship. So I think, to a lot of academics' credit, I mean, a lot of this is just a practical business decision, but you'll find a lot of academics starting YouTube channels these days. I feel like in the last couple of years, there's been, while I'm an expert in, uh, Gotland in the 8th century, specifically Gotlandish jewelry in the 8th century, and so they've got a whole YouTube channel just about that, and a lot of them are making more money than they would at a university, and are reaching a broader, more receptive audience than they would at the university, and I think that's great. So I would just say, let's keep it up, let's keep the guns firing, and not let the enemy rest for a second. It's an uphill battle, but it must be fought.
So one thing that you mentioned, and that something that's actually come up a lot with us being on Reddit, has been that idea of being at the front lines of history and reaching new audiences. For example, in Ask Historians, we know that our audience trends American, male, white, and ages between about 16 and 24.
Yeah.
And so I was curious, in your engagement with your audience in your film, how do you try and navigate the fact that many of the people that you're going to be dealing with are going to have come up in a milieu that is a little bit more resistant to some of the ideas that you're putting forward? I mean, for example, in Checkmate Lincolnites, you always have those clips from, or comments, and responding to them. I mean, do you have any idea, like, who your audience is in terms of demographics? Do you know, like, how effective your videos have been?
I don't know how effective my videos have been. I do have a pretty good handle on my audience. I've got about, but I don't know if there's any sort of, if this data can be, if a pattern can be extrapolated from this data reliably. But about half of my audience is American. About half of them is foreign, or are not American. He said with a scowl. No, but which is interesting, because I overwhelmingly just do American history. But that's cool, right? I mean, I think it's, we've got a lot of Europeans, Australians, mostly a lot of people from English-speaking countries, a lot of South Americans, which is interesting. Not too many from Africa and Asia, but, everybody's welcome, just for whatever reason. But yeah, I think, because it's an English-speaking channel, it's probably, a lot of the people who are not from English-speaking countries are probably, a little more on the educated side or whatever, maybe a little bit better off. Generally, I think my audience is young. I think it's pretty similar. I think most of them are probably white, but that YouTube doesn't tell you that. It would be kind of creepy if they did. But yeah, I think most of them are young. It's like 18 to 34. So kind of Zoomers and younger millennials. And overwhelmingly male, which is really unfortunate, and I'd like to change that. But it's also kind of par for the course when it comes to not just a history channel that covers the sort of things that I cover, which is kind of war, devastation, blood, death, and murder, but also just YouTube channels hosted by men just generally attract a male audience for whatever reason.
This is a conversation that I've had with other public-facing historians as well. For example, we spoke recently with Dr. Brett Devereaux, and who's author of a very popular blog, and kind of heard similar things. He knows that most of his audience is largely American, Anglophone, if not, and that it tends to be male, because people are, especially for the topics that he covers, tends to be war-focused. Much of what you does is Civil War, King Philip's War, and so on. And that actually gets to another question that I kind of had, and it has to do with ownership of doing history and who gets to tell history. For example, you mentioned that your adopted town of New Orleans. So where do you see yourself coming in and telling these stories? Because I know in New Orleans, obviously there's a very strong idea of who was born and raised there versus who's coming in.
Yeah.
And that extends to other fields of history as well. So like, where do you see yourself as coming in and being able to tell these stories? Do you think that is a responsibility that you have as somebody who's doing history? Is it just, this is where your interests lie, so this is what I'm going to do? Can you kind of walk us through that
Yeah.
thought process a little bit?
Yeah, honestly, I think you nailed it, which is, this is where my interests lie, so that's what I'm going to do. I do, like, I mean, I obviously feel a profound sense of responsibility as somebody who people, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, look up to as like an expert. And not being, I don't consider myself a historian. I consider myself a filmmaker first, and a history educator or a documentarian a distant second, right? Like, and I try to be as vigorous and as rigorous as possible. And because I feel a profound sense of responsibility to get it as right as possible. And I make mistakes, everybody does. Yeah, I think having an audience is a very profound responsibility that shouldn't be taken lightly. I think it's an interesting question you raise about the sort of New Orleans sort of nativism, which is a thing, as you know, Thomas, because your parents are from there, as we were talking about before we started recording. Yeah, that's for sure a thing. I mean, I definitely, I think that I have a certain skill set that allows me to communicate history in an accessible and entertaining way. And I think kind of at the end of the day, maybe that's all that matters. I do think that however, I do think it's very important to incorporate other perspectives other than my own, especially when it comes to something like New Orleans, which is a city with a very long, very sad history that I'm not a part of. You know what I mean? That, I wasn't here during Katrina, for example, and I think when I first started making New Orleans history videos, sometimes people would say, "Oh, are you going to cover Katrina, this, that, the other thing?" And yeah, no. If I did, I would not appear in it. You know what I mean? Because then it would kind of be about me and like, oh, it's the funny Checkmate Lincolnites guy, and he's the host of this thing, And so if I did do something about that, it would be sort of a documentary with actual survivors on screen, and I'd just be filming it or whatever, I think there's, and so yeah, I think it's important to. I like to kind of have. I don't like to speak just out of my own lack of experience. When I'm talking about these issues, I like to kind of have my fingers on the pulse. Maybe I'll just like text an old tour guide buddy who is here, or or a buddy who's a Black New Orleanian whose family's been here for hundreds of years, and whose great grandpappy was a jazz musician with Buddy Bolden, and you know what I mean, like, and just be like, so like, how would you phrase this or whatever, I don't really subscribe to the idea that like, oh well, if you're not from here, you can't talk about it, because frankly, that's fucking stupid. I do have a sense of responsibility about it, but I don't think that just because of who I am or my background makes me unqualified to speak about this. I think at the end of the day, I have a skill set that lends itself well to this, and ultimately, that's all that matters. Do we want these stories to be told under exactly the right circumstances, or do we want them to be told at all? Does that make sense? You know what I mean? It's like, if it's not me doing it, it's probably nobody who's going to be doing it. I don't know. Maybe that comes across as a little harsh. I don't mean to be.
And I'm not going to say one is right or wrong or anything like that, but for example, our guiding ethos at Ask Historians is that no answer is better than a wrong answer or a bad answer.
Yeah.
And I don't want to, and it does speak to a certain philosophical difference between our two formats, where, the medium of film is one that's a little bit more involved. Once you are out down the track of filming, scripting, and so on, there's you can't go back and press the edit button as easily as you can in a blog post, a write-up of something. It's a lot easier for us to go back and correct mistakes, add on more information, and so on. And so I don't want to, I can say that I personally don't necessarily see those differences as, irreconcilable or anything. We're all trying to do history, and we're all trying to do the best job that we can. And we do have distinct differences in how we approach that and what our beliefs on that are.
Yeah, sure. And well, I don't need, I actually agree with you. I'm not saying that, I agree that no answer is better than a wrong answer, but I do think that like, uh, yeah. And I think, I also think that people will get things wrong and that you can always kind of go back and do a second edition or, I think with film or with video making, you can do that too, which is you could take a video down or offer a retraction or remake a video or something like that, yeah, and like I said, I make minor errors all the freaking time, but I try to issue corrections as promptly as I can, and all that. So I think, yeah, I think we agree. I maybe I'm not phrasing this particularly well, but I do think that we ultimately agree.
All right, well, so that leads to another question that I had, and this is going to be a little bit more in the filmmaking side rather than in the historical public outreach side.
Yeah.
And I was curious. So your interest in historical films is very evident. You've got the takedowns of Gettysburg, Gods and Generals. You've got some of the older stuff. I think you did a video on the Mummy way back when. And I had a couple of questions about that in general, not the Mummy specifically, but just that kind of historical film. And it was, what are your personal favorite historical films? And do you differentiate between films that are good as being historically accurate, or enjoy more films that are good despite historical inaccuracy?
Yeah. So I think, it's a good question, and if you've sort of seen some of my videos about historical accuracy in film, my mind has kind of changed on this pretty significantly. Yeah, look, like I said, I'm a filmmaker first and a historian or historical educator second, right? So ultimately, I think that like the goal of a film is to tell a good story, and um, and I think that history kind of does take a back seat to that, though. However, there's kind of a flip side, which is that, and this also kind of goes with the whole sort of having a sense of responsibility when you have a large audience, which I think a lot of Hollywood filmmakers just don't really have, which is when you're dealing with important historical issues, you maybe have an obligation to present it in a more accurate way, or in a way that at least is not going to peddle misinformation and peddle myths, and we've seen this with several high profile examples, like you said, with the Gods and Generals, or the sort of I think the most famous example is the Patriot, but so honestly, I think it's very much kind of a case by case basis. I found myself on kind of with an interesting new perspective on this, because in the last couple of years, as I said, I directed a film, a historical film, and on a very low budget, and having to sort of navigate accuracy kind of versus what had to be kind of practically, it couldn't be 100% accurate because I just didn't have the resources for that. So kind of picking and choosing sort of what was going to be the most authentic aspect of it, was a really interesting exercise. And with stuff like with material culture, like the costumes and the weaponry and stuff, there are like for sure some inaccuracies in there. But I think that we did a pretty good job, maybe with one or two exceptions that the eagle-eyed, I'm sure, will will be able to discern quite quickly. But I think we did a pretty good job of to the layperson, I think they would be pretty convinced. And I think, our costumes and our material culture was like very high quality for the budget that we had. But I quickly kind of, what became very immediately apparent is when you have nothing, when you have no resources, the script, the page is kind of where you can afford to be the most accurate, and where you can really kind of pierce to the center of a time period zeitgeist and a time period's psychology, and a certain psychology of historical people, and with my film, which takes place in 1678 in Massachusetts, we very much did that with the Puritans, and I think it's there are inaccuracies, and there are some purposeful, some just, like I said, budgetary, that just had to be, it's like, well, we couldn't afford the really good accurate gun So we've gotten an anachronistic one because we just couldn't afford it, Um, but so I think we do a damn good job of making uh, of showing the Puritan mindset, and specifically the mindset of Massachusetts Bay Colony after King Philip's War, and sort of what that war did to those people. I think we captured very well, but that's all in the page, right? That's all creative. That's not, that doesn't have to do with budget necessarily. It doesn't have to do with logistics. It's kind of like, okay, what kind of story do you want to tell? And I think that, while maybe am more forgiving of historical inaccuracy than most people um, in the historical education fields, I think ultimately there's really sort of no excuse to not try and get it right on the creative side and on the page and in the script, because ultimately, in my opinion, a movie that is historically accurate in terms of mindset and in terms of psychology is going to be so much more interesting just naturally because it actually happened and there's real humanity in there than something that was made up by a 21st century Hollywood screenwriter who's maybe trying to make like an anachronistic or sort of modernized point. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
The example that actually keeps coming to my mind is Braveheart.
Sure. Yeah.
Which and I find it a very enjoyable film. In
Me
telling
too. I
its
love that movie.
story, but obviously when you're talking about the material culture, the costuming, and so on, especially of the Scots,
Oh, it's fucking garbage. Yeah.
it's abysmal.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's an argument to be made that it is not telling a story about William Wallace's resistance to the English crown. It's a story about rebellion more broadly. And then actually, but that one of the points you raised, particularly talking about a movie that gets into the psychology, into the mindset of historical figures. Are there any movies that you think do a really good job of that?
Yeah, they're out there. I mean, I think, I made a video about this a while back that I had a few examples. I think um, yeah, I think probably the most prominent modern example is the work of Robert Eggers, who's also, a 17th century Puritan guy, who was kind of into that stuff. I think, all three of his, I think they're just the three movies that he's made, but the three kind of big famous ones, The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman. I think all three of them very wonderfully and authentically capture their respective time periods. Yeah, in a great way. And the psychology of that, I think The Lighthouse is far and away his best movie. And I think that one in particular really captures the Moby Dick coastal New England, kind of New Bedford, Gloucester, Lobster Coast sort of, seafaring mindset of the 19th century. Kind of some older, kind of more obscure things. Andrei Rublev, the Tarkovsky film, I think is a really wonderful. Is kind of unique as a medieval film, especially as sort of what Americans think of as a medieval film. Because there's like a battle or two, but it's not really about that. It's about an artist, right? And it's about the journey of an artist, of an icon painter in medieval Russia, and so it's about this man's religious faith and his artistic journey, and certainly being a Russian film about medieval Russia also helps because there's kind of a cultural background that the filmmakers were able to draw from. That I think that's really wonderfully authentic to the life of a artistic medieval monk. I think Quest for Fire is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's about Neanderthals, and there's not a spoken word of any real language. It's just grunting and hooting, and Ron Perlman and a lot of makeup, and but not that much makeup. And I think it's dated anthropologically and archaeologically speaking now because it's about a 40-year-old movie now. But I think that I've never seen the Stone Age brought to life more vividly on film than Quest for Fire. I mean, it will just transport you there, truly.
So another question that I have, again, kind of sticking with the filmmaking aspect of it. In your own work, whether this is in your own, you said you directed shorts, you have your upcoming film, as well as in your YouTube channel. Are there any particular directors' films that you've seen as particularly influential on your own work?
Yeah, I mean, well, we talked about Mel Gibson and Braveheart, and I, yeah, I don't think that he and I would get along very well if we met, and I think that he's not a well man. But I really fucking love his movies. like, I think I have to say, I mean, especially Braveheart and Apocalypto. The Passion is a very well made movie, but it's also kind of a flaming pile of trash in every other way, other than the beauty of the cinematography. Certainly, the politics of the movie are absolutely abysmal, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, the Braveheart and Apocalypto are really incredibly well executed movies, very kinetic. I mean, they have. I mean, I think I don't want to sort of, I guess, psychoanalyze somebody I've never met, but I think that Mel Gibson, if you see him in interviews, and he's just a very manic type of person. And I think there is a sort of mania that guy has, and I think that comes across beautifully in those movies. Like, those are very kinetic, manic movies. They're always moving. They're always taking you someplace. They never let you breathe. And that's something that I've always wanted to that I've always like put into my own work. I mean, and then it's sort of the basic bitch answer, but it's because he's so great. But Steven Spielberg, I mean, the dude is the Shakespeare of film. Like, you just cannot. Possibly the greatest director who've ever lived. I'm sorry, John Ford, but The Searchers is kind of overrated. Not gonna lie. But yeah, I mean, Spielberg. I mean, just the raw talent that guy continues to have. I saw his latest movie, The Fablemans, and it was outstanding. Like, and the dude's 1,000 years old and he's still cranking out masterpieces. And yeah, I mean, certainly lots of influences. I'm in a way kind of influenced by every kind of little thing that I make. I mean, and all sorts of stuff. Whether it's kind of really intense, violent historical movies like the Mel Gibson ones, or I mean, I have a web series called Frozen 50s Man, which is very much inspired by not only kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark and sort of these globe-trotting adventure movies, but also Police Squad, the Leslie Nielsen show, and the very sort of high, broad humor and everything like that. Another inspiration, just consistently, not just for Frozen 50s Man, but for Checkmate Lincolnites, and for a lot of my work is The Mummy. Those first two Mummy movies, huge part of my childhood, and that first one I just think is just the quintessential action adventure picture. Like, I think maybe it's the nostalgia talking, but I think it's right up there with Raiders in terms of just being just pure fun, pure swashbuckling fun. So and yeah, and I also like disgusting, transgressive, artsy shit. That's kind of the other thing, is really gross foreign movies and really artsy, surreal things like Gaspar Noé and yeah. That's
You're well over my head over there. I can talk about The Mummy. I can't talk about foreign surreal films.
No, totally. Well, and I'm sure your audience is kind of just like, okay, whatever. But since it's mostly historical people, but hey, I went to film school. Sue me.
I would assume the bleed over between historical people who are interested in history, people who are interested in historical films, it's less a Venn diagram and more of a circle.
Yeah, I think so. It's a love-hate relationship, I think, that a lot of people have with it.
It is. Yeah. And for example, I have yet to find a medievalist who does not adore A Knight's Tale.
Oh,
not
really?
an accurate movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I have yet to meet a single medievalist who does not love that film.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of fun. I mean, and I feel like Geoffrey Chaucer I feel like looms so large in the history of the High Middle Ages and in the literature of English literature of the time, that kind of having him show up and played by Paul Bettany and being really kooky is just, must be a joy for those medieval nerds. You know what I mean? Like
when I was in grad school, we had medieval movie night.
Nice.
Every month we did Name of the Rose, A Knight's Tale.
Nice.
I missed a couple of them. Monty Python and the Holy Grail,
Oh,
obviously
yeah,
the most accurate film that's ever been put on film.
I mean, there have been worse. There's worse out there.
One aspect, though, that you touched on in in a lot of the movies that you've mentioned and in some of the work that you've done has been kind of an ongoing interest with the occult. And that goes back actually to something that you mentioned early on, was talking about when you were a tour guide, that distinction between folklore and history.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you're talking or when you're looking at historical figures, obviously for them, it was not folklore or the occult. It was a
Right.
part of their lived reality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so how do you find or do you find that there's a way to navigate that tension where obviously in the modern day we have very different ideas about what demons and devils and so on are
Yeah.
or aren't, compared to historical figures for whom these were very real dangers?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, I think it's very interesting how I think, the evolution of folklore is really interesting. How it kind of, how it has so many parallels to just human belief systems and psychology, and even something like culture and language, and how culture and language kind of evolve. I think folklore and mythology evolves in a lot of the same way. It's like, I remember when I was young, and like when I was a kid, and getting into ancient Egypt and reading about how and I am feeling especially self-conscious because I know your audiences are, and I bow down to you guys because you are the real deal. You're the adults in the room, and I'm just a clown with a video camera. But so I'm going to get things monstrously wrong that are not in my area of expertise, so I apologize. But like reading about ancient Egypt, and it's like how well, and then the cult of Isis merged with the cult of Athena, which then was associated with this pharaoh who and then this pharaoh then became the god in this pantheon, and you kind of think like, well, couldn't people at the time just see how made up and stupid that this was? It's like, well, of course, people, this pharaoh is just co-opting this cult for political clout or whatever, or but then you kind of you look at the time spans that were involved in kind of the ancient world's the genesis of folklore and mythology in the ancient world and how that evolved, and then you kind of look at like Star Wars canon, you know what I mean? And like, and it's just like, well, actually, the reason that Ben Kenobi was fighting like an old man in a B movie and not like a ninja like he was 20 years earlier was because he was, his voodoo hide cloak was preventing him from his full power. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, I kind of, and you see, I don't know, I feel like QAnon is another great example of this, how that sort of evolved, and how that belief system kind of evolved. It's a very similar, it's a similar, same shit, different day, the cult of Isis becoming the cult of Athena, and these different belief systems, even if we sort of, specifically kind of with the Star Wars thing, or with something like, I don't know, like the canon of A Song of Ice and Fire or whatever, stuff that we know is fictional. This stuff still evolves, and like it evolves as a belief system and as a world, and as a mythology, in a way that's kind of, I think, so the study of folklore, a very long answer, apologize, very roundabout answer, but like I think the study of folklore is kind of the glue that sort of holds, our civilization together. You know what I mean? It's kind of the stories that we tell ourselves, whether it's, a Wikipedia article about, whatever class of rebel ship in The Empire Strikes Back, and the very specific explanations for various things that were probably just cobbled together by some special effects artist 40 years ago for no reason, that together with like, we found this shroud that's got Jesus's blood on it, so let's invent a story about how he ran into some guy named Carl when he was going to the crucifixion, and and said, hey, can I have a paper towel? And Carl said, sure, have a whole roll. And and he got his blood on it. No, now it's in our church. It's very, there is kind of, I think, a similarity there, if that makes any sense at all. Probably not. I apologize to the whole world for this podcast. Anyway, so I think that's very interesting, and I think the way that demons and monsters kind of fit into that is really great. As a fan of the occult, and as a fan of horror, and personally, I think because I see very little difference between beliefs in goblins and demons and devils than I do with again, like certain political narratives today, or um, or yeah, like the you look at the study of the way that, St. Augustine wrote about Christianity is the same way that a lot of, my colleagues on YouTube write about Doctor Who. It's still the same. I feel like it's the same tenor of intellectual analysis. It's just applied to different things. So I find it very easy to kind of put myself into the shoes of somebody, 400, 4,000 years ago or whatever, who believed in the literal existence of demons and who had elaborate explanations to explain them, because I have elaborate explanations and theories about Jon Snow's parentage, you know, which is, I feel like, is kind of comes from the same place intellectually or psychologically.
There's a certain through line between human cultures where we're still looking at the world around us, whether that is modern media, whether that's ancient religions, and coming up with explanations that work for us.
Yeah.
And whether the reality of that situation can change depending on where you are in history and what your beliefs are, but there's a certain level of continuity in how people are perceiving the world around them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think there's generally I think there's really very little difference in our lives and the lives of historical people, the vast majority of historical people. I see a lot of, I think, public facing educators making this mistake all the time. I feel like you can't, listen to, a history podcast or whatever, present company excluded, who doesn't say like, well, of course they believed this stupid thing about, the Jews poisoning the wells because in the Middle Ages everybody was stupid and terrible and had bad teeth and was awful, and you just died of shitting yourself when you were 4 years old, and that was life. And uh, honestly, that kind of shit infuriates me, Thomas. I got to say, like, it's this arrogant viewpoint that everything's so much more evolved now. And I think, I mean, you look back at the earliest, at some of the earliest writing, and it's, Yelp reviews, but in cuneiform. You know what I mean? It's you owe me money on my grain shipment. It's just people bitching and moaning and being petty, like they always have been and they always are. And I'm kind of, I think obviously there's cultural differences. Obviously there's differences in quality of life, but I think that, that my life as, somebody who lives in urban New Orleans isn't that different from somebody from a bard who lived in urban Ur, 6,000 years ago. I really don't. Like, I
You have
think
better
that,
food, at least.
yeah. But, I think I really don't think that I think that life across most, and I think sort of ultimately, I think somebody on a ranch in Wyoming's life isn't that unrecognizably different from somebody who was on a farm in medieval Scandinavia. You know what I mean? I think that ultimately we have a lot more in common with historical people than we think.
Yeah, no, that's actually a constant tension that historians have to navigate. Is there's a very famous quote, the past is a different country. They do things differently there. And then you read the actual sources and you're like, well, these people are just like me. There's a lot of cases that we can point at. There's I mean, walking down Bourbon Street and then walk down Pompeii, and the two things
Yeah.
are not going to be that dissimilar.
Well, when I first moved here, when I was walking down Bourbon Street, I was like, this is like the Forum. You know what I mean? This is Babylon. you know, Not to sound like one of those street preachers or but it is kind of it is kind of like, that's probably not too dissimilar from what it was like walking down the streets of Eridu, down the main drag with all the strippers.
I was trying to come up with a joke to make about that, and the connotations of Bourbon Street, but
Yeah.
you beat me to the punch there.
Well, yeah.
So you mentioned the being on the front lines of history, and especially on places like YouTube, which, I mean, the meme going back decades is never read the YouTube comment section, because there's nothing good there. And so I wanted to ask, what has been your experience of engaging with people in the YouTube comment section, whether that's pulling their comments out onto Checkmate Lincolnites and to make fun of them and tell them why they're wrong, do you see a lot of supportive messages in there? Do you see a lot of people who are like kind of in that same conflict, trying to help the spread of historical information and combating false narratives? Kind of what is the engagement like from your end on those people who you're trying to reach, but are clearly taking either the wrong message or willfully stuck in their ways?
Yeah, that's. I'm afraid I have a pretty pessimistic answer to that. From the, I mean, I've been making YouTube videos for 4 years. It's been my job for 2. And I have to say, I have, if I am, if we want to continue that military metaphor, being on the front line, I have to say I've come back from the front with a 1,000-yard stare and with a severe case of PTSD. And honestly, I'm not super hopeful. um, I think that, okay, well, look. So most comments, especially that I get from like the regular audience or whatever, are overwhelmingly positive, and as it should be, right? Or that would make sense, because these are people who watch my stuff and who enjoy my work, right? As far as you said, sort of as you put it, kind of the people that I'm trying to reach, I've to be honest, I've kind of given up trying to reach them. I have, I think, somewhat noticeably kind of taken a few dozen steps back from the sort of hot button culture war issues. My flagship show, Checkmate Lincolnites, which is about debunking the lost cause myth, which of course, as I'm sure everybody listening knows, is a very politically charged topic and a very controversial topic, certainly among Americans. I'm ending that. And I'm not going to do lost cause stuff anymore, except as it incidentally comes up just in coverage of the Civil War. Um, you know, the the biggest reason that I'm stopping that and why I'm not doing that anymore is because I've said what I need to say, and I don't want to belabor it. And I want, and this is a series that means a lot to a lot of people, and I want it to end strong. I want to be looked back at as a body of work, 10 episodes that were pretty good, and then they began, and there was a middle, and then there was an end, and you can go back anytime you want and pop Checkmate Lincolnites into your VHS player and watch it and enjoy it years from now. That's the main reason. The secondary reason is that I think I'm kind of catching a lot of flack for and a lot of negative attention in a way that's not necessarily helping the situation, or I don't think is helping me personally. You know what I mean? I'm certainly a controversial figure among kind of broad segments of the population. Certainly, a lot of certainly, yeah. I guess your average kind of the South was right type of person, whatever you want to call it. Certainly, don't like me very much, but I think that. Let me rephrase that. I don't think I put that well. So the second kind of reason that I'm stopping this is because I don't really feel like it's helping. I maybe it has reached the people that it has to reach. Maybe it reached a few people on the fence, but I think the diehard kind of neo-Confederates, frankly, are just going to have to die off. Like I think that's kind of the only thing that's going to do it, right? And I don't think that my goofy YouTube videos are really making the impact that. Really making, I don't know. Fuck. I'm sorry. I'm getting self-conscious. I feel like such a downer, but maybe I am being a downer. I'm sorry, Thomas.
No,
No,
it actually is something that historians have to deal with as well. For
yeah,
example, I study the Middle Ages, and one of that, I studied like the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons and so
yeah,
on. And there's a lot of stuff that comes up that is of a particular political bent that I think should die in a fire.
sure.
Um, and then, I mean, even there's gradients to it, like things like whenever I see things online about like what Vikings were like, it's always inevitably wrong. But there's white supremacist leanings to it. There is neo-Nazi elements to a lot of kind of the work that I am pushing against, and I can
Yeah.
definitely see how that would be like, why am I still doing this? Like, what is the payoff for doing all of this emotional labor, all of this kind of wading in and dealing with these people that I would
Yeah.
rather just not deal with.
Yeah. Well, and you just put it better than I did and articulated with that. So, and here I can take. I'll do another take here. So I'll do take 3. So the second reason is that I feel like it's a never-ending struggle, and I don't think I'm really. I think I am helping. I think ultimately, I think I might be a nail, a tiny little nail in the coffin of the lost cause, but some days it sure doesn't feel like it, and and sometimes I think it's not really worth it to keep sort of, you know, getting my feet all dirty, or getting my hands dirty, wading in the muck of the internet. Maybe I'm just kind of sick of wading in the muck of the internet. Maybe that's it.
The bit that because I've been kind of looking forward to doing like interviews, just talking with people who are doing public history, because it can often get you can feel somewhat isolated doing it, because you can feel like you're pushing back against a lot of these things that, okay, am I actually making a difference? Am I actually doing anything here? And that's one of the reasons that I've kind of started this pushing away all the other historic people who don't actually want to associate with you guys anymore. Just trying to get together people who are of a similar mind in regards to the value of historical outreach. Like, why is it important? Because the academy is dying, right? And the forefront of historical public outreach is going to be YouTube. It's going to be, God forbid, Reddit. It will be Twitter. It will be those. Well, as long as Twitter's around, it will be those places. And I think that there is value in making sure that.
100%. No, and like I said, I mean, I think it's we're putting good history out on the internet is a good kind of stopgap. It's a good way to kind of fight misinformation and myth making in the short term. Ultimately though, systemic problems require systemic solutions, and this is something that has to be addressed in the education system, right? Like, ultimately that's kind of what's going to solve this problem, rather than just delay it from fully taking its catastrophic effect, right? So I think, sort of ultimately, like I said, humanities need to be emphasized more with children, with young people. Maybe math and science should be focused on a little bit less, and maybe media literacy and history and these kinds of things, and the arts and creativity should be maybe valued a little bit more. You could sort of, a lot of people argue that it's frivolous or that it doesn't really matter, but I would say, I mean, again, maybe I'm biased just because I'm of an artistic bent myself, but I think that good reason that we're sort of that we're facing a lot of the problems we're facing today, whether it be anti-intellectualism or climate change or sort of corporate greed run mad or government overreach, you name it, kind of comes from a lack of solid education about civics, about history, about sort of who we are, how we ended up here, where we came from, and kind of what trajectory we're on. And this comes from and oftentimes, learning how to analyze a historical event, or even just learning how to appreciate a good poem or whatever, or know what the fuck is going on in a Shakespeare play. Like these seemingly frivolous pursuits give you such a good grounding in just understanding humanity, understanding our societies, our civilizations, understanding, like we're talking about our cultures and our myths. Having a focus on the humanity gives us such much more of makes us so much more educated and so much more informed as an electorate, as a people, as a species. You know what I mean? And hopefully that'll kind of lead us toward I really do think that would lead us toward a more compassionate and equitable future. So yeah, I think, Thomas, what you're doing is and what the Ask Historians people are doing is really wonderful and really crucial. And and we're out there on the front line, and I'll see you in the trenches, brother. See, that was more hopeful. I wasn't
Then,
quite as much of a fucking downer.
I was just about to say I was kind of coming up with a couple of things that we could talk about to end on a higher note.
Yeah.
Um, like one of them. So which of the video series that you've made do you think has been the most enjoyable to make? Which of the videos that you've made that aren't necessarily a labor of love and not necessarily something that you feel a responsibility to do, but which are the ones that you have done and just said, I want to do this and I had a lot of fun doing this one project?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. Well, I think I did a video called "Following Bienville" last year or the year before, where I dressed up as a 18th century explorer and I traced the route of the first founders of New Orleans. Went down in a kayak down Bayou St. John, then walked through the city, getting drunk and waving a flag of the Bourbon monarchy, and kind of talked about the history of the founding of the city along the way, and I think that was just a ton of fun to do, not just because it was outside on a beautiful day and I was drinking beer with my friends and doing fun stuff, but just I just love that format. I love kind of getting outside and sort of in the places where things happened and sort of speaking directly to them. I love local history. I love, having a strong sense of place, of standing on a spot and saying, oh, this is where it went down. I think that's just the coolest feeling in the world. And yeah, I love that format. I was very much inspired by the Long Way series that Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman do. It's kind of the silly kind of travel log type of thing. And I really love that. And then another one that I really, really loved doing was a kind of more traditional documentary that I did called "In Defense of Puritanism," which was a kind of an hour-long history of the Puritan movement, where I kind of framed it as a progressive social justice movement, which is a hot take, I know, but I'll stand by it, goddammit. And sort of traced Puritanism's sort of rise and fall as a democratizing movement. I was filming all over New England for that. I did a lot of dressing up in various fun 17th century costumes and got to play around with a lot of surreal, weird, artsy imagery, which is one of my favorite little filmmaking things to do. Yeah, I kind of framed it all as sort of being this sort of going in keeping with the Puritans' idea of sort of personal spirituality and sort of a personal connection with the divine. I kind of paired that with, I feel like maybe, which is the closest sort of 21st century millennial version of that, which is tripping balls. And also taking a lot of inspiration from the film A Field in England. I basically turned this history of Puritanism into a giant acid trip. And I think it turned out really well. And I really, really enjoyed making that one.
I'm sure the Puritans would have had some thoughts about that sort of analogy.
Maybe, yeah. Well, they had thoughts about a lot of shit. They were a very opinionated bunch.
So that's at least to kind of a follow-up question that I had then. You've mentioned the common humanity in a lot of the works that you've talked about, looking back for those kinds of elements of continued threads of what makes people in, whether that is in the Puritans or in, we talked about the other places and so on. How do you still do you think that kind of work is more or less valuable with a group like the Puritans? Because they're a group of people who don't exactly have a great reputation in modern day America. So do you think that it is worth emphasizing that the Puritans had a dimensionality to them that we might not necessarily appreciate from the outside, and then square that with, but they hanged people for being witches?
Yeah. No, I think it is really important. 100%. Yeah. And again, I think it's a question of, like you said, drawing kind of maybe some modern parallels. I think there's parallels to between the Puritans' agitation in England, specifically kind of leading up to the English Civil Wars and sort of in terms of a micro focus, specifically the Levelers. I think the Leveler pamphlets bear striking similarities to the thinkers of the civil rights movement, to a lot of the more radical kind of elements of whatever you want to call the current social justice movement that we're going through. I mean, these were just very a lot of these people were even though they were coming from a place of religious piety that maybe is hard for a lot of people to connect to. Um, uh, certainly a lot of secular people to connect to. They were immensely ahead of their time in so many ways, just in terms of universal male suffrage. What an idea! You know what I mean? And in the 1640s, this stuff was truly radical. And I think that if you can kind of forget about the witch hanging for a second and just kind of take these words, and forget about the hypocrisies, or embrace the hypocrisies and embrace and realize that we all have hypocrisies, and and just kind of take these words as they were written. I think there is power to them, and there's we can kind of draw pretty direct lines, or at least I would draw a pretty direct line between the radicals of the English Civil War and the radicals of the American Revolution and of the English Enlightenment, and I mean. So yeah, I think and it does kind of frustrate me as well when I heard one YouTube creator basically talking about this time period, and they said, and they were talking about 17th century philosophers. I think maybe John Milton or something, some 17th century thinker, and who was espousing a lot of these democratic ideas. And they said, from a certain perspective, you could kind of see how this would be pretty progressive stuff, but they still wouldn't give the franchise to women and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, I mean, no, from really any perspective that matters, this was incredibly radical stuff, certainly, not looking back maybe, but just kind of putting yourself in the shoes of the time. This was revolutionary, just nothing short of revolutionary. So yeah, and so I don't know, but I generally like to, I think it's also, I think also maybe what helps me kind of slip so easily into the shoes of historical people, oftentimes very abhorrent historical people, is I'm also fairly pessimistic about sort of us today. You know what I mean? And I think that we're very much unfinished products ourselves. I don't think that we're at the end of history by any means, and so I think that, I can kind of recognize aspects of myself that will probably be viewed as horribly backward in 100 years. And so I think maybe that lends me a little bit more empathy for people who, were horribly backward then, and maybe an ability to kind of like parse out like the one or two things that sort of is more human about them, like, I don't know, like Stonewall Jackson's relationship with his wife, which was actually very sweet, but he was also a piece of shit who owned people and fought for the slave republic. You know what I mean? Yeah, but that's those hypocrisies and inconsistencies. That's where the humanity lies, right? That's sort of in all of its messy glory, I think that's where the real sort of where it gets really interesting when you're looking at these historical personages.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, being a medieval historian, there's a lot of similar, I would say, biases against the Middle Ages, as you would see in times like the Puritan, where nobody really wants to talk about the things that they were doing that we might be more sympathetic to nowadays, due to histories of pop cultural representations, due to kind of the way that they're viewed in a modern society that might not necessarily hold up to how we actually can see them, if we're going to be looking at them and engaging them on their own terms.
Yeah, for sure. Well, no, I mean, and you guys have it really hard as well with everybody was covered in mud, and I mean, again, Monty Python, the Holy Grail. That must be the king. He hasn't got shit all over him. Um, I mean, whereas, I mean, yeah, in reality, I mean, you know better than I do. I mean, I'm sure even, I mean, even your area of specialty, the early Middle Ages, uh, was far from a time of, of sort of stagnation and backsliding that we often think of it as, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've had
I mean, in
many
Europe, I
many
mean,
times.
obviously, yeah, but, different
No,
story in the Middle East and stuff, right?
oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things like when we're talking about some of just mods or people on the subreddit and so on, we've talked about how one day the Middle Ages will have a movie where they're allowed to be colorful.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened yet, but at some point,
Well,
some point.
it's interesting as well that you bring that up because, and I was talking to a reenactor friend about this recently, which was, uh, when making my film, The Sudbury Devil, um, I wanted to make it. Initially, I went into it thinking that it would be colorful. I wanted to make it a colorful movie, and a lot of the costumes that I got are very colorful. There's yellows and pinks and greens and stuff like that, like just very deep, very popping colors. And then kind of what we realized was that, and even something like like the house that we sort of the main house that we shot at, main period house, was painted yellow. It was sort of like a beigey kind of yellow. This is accurate for the time. People painted their houses, and so yeah, it totally, even though the Puritans specifically weren't the brightest color dressers in the world, but not everybody in the film is, a devout Puritan, to say the least. Some of them are not about that at all. But it is a very colorful movie, and we realized, that that we couldn't have it be that colorful. We realized that we had to. So basically, in a lot of the coloration, the color correction that we're doing, we're desaturating it. We're making it a little bit gray or a little bit more brown because we showed it to people who don't know much about history, and they thought it was distracting, and they thought it was historically inaccurate, and it distracted them. And like the house in particular, like showed it to one person who just doesn't really know much about the period, and they were just like, "Why did you use a modern house?" And we said, no, that's a period house. This is like, I mean, the house we used was like, our film takes place in 1678. This house was built in like 1712, but it's a period house. It's a very old New England house. And he was like, I did not get that at all. And so basically what we have to do now is we have to go in and digitally make the house more brown and shitty looking. Because to a certain extent, like you have to play to audience expectations, because if you don't, you can only sort of subvert things too far, because if you go too far in an accurate direction that people aren't expecting, then it'll be actively distracting.
Yeah,
It's really interesting how that works.
Yeah, it's actually similar to a conversation that we had on the last podcast that I did, where we were talking about how you can't necessarily give somebody a modern view of some historical periods. In particular, we're talking about Sparta, because the pop culture depiction and understanding of Sparta is so warped to how historians understand it currently. You kind of have to lead them slowly through the stages of historical thought before you can get to the modern one. Because if you show them the modern understanding, they're going to be like, well, this is completely ridiculous. I don't understand this at all. Whereas other times you have to kind of lead them through what they know more slowly before they can finally get to the end product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's really funny how this stuff works just psychologically. But yeah. I'm a big fan of Ask Historians. I'm on there like all the time, and the moderation is very strict, but maybe that's how it should be, And I think that keeping the answers really high quality is I think it's a very good way to go about it for specifically Reddit, right? I think that like with Reddit, it can be easy to get bogged down by by the threads and by all the replies and replies of the replies and all that kind of stuff. And I think with any historical education, there's going to be certain voices that are prioritized over other ones, and a lot of that is subject to human error, of course. And so it's not always going to be and just generally there's no one answer to any question, right? But like but all that said, kind of given the circumstances and the limitations of dealing with Reddit and with just like social media historical education, I think that Ask Historians does a really valuable thing, because on Reddit you're allowed long replies that can really get into nuance, stuff with like easily readable hyperlinks and stuff like that, where you can link people to sources. I think is really valuable in a way that like you just don't see on other social media platforms, right? Like Facebook is full of memes that fucking oversimplify extremely complicated historical events and put quotes out of context and stuff like that. Same with Twitter. I mean, I think the Twitter thread is just about the fucking worst way to educate anybody about anything. And I think what you kind of like end up with on so many of these other social media sites and other subreddits too is sort of like, it is really jumbled memes or jumbled threads, where there are a lot of half truths and misstatements that people who come away from that, because they kind of like are scrolling past it and they forget about it, it's kind of half remembered. So if they're sort of talking to somebody else about it, they'll be like, oh, so this, that, and the other thing happened in the Civil War. And they might ask, oh, where'd you learn that? Oh, I don't know, Reddit. But I think Ask Historians, for all the limitations of just Reddit as a platform, I think it's the best that we have in terms of in terms of public education, where you can just say like, oh, where'd you read that? Oh, well, it was on the specific subreddit and the specific question. And you look down and there's like 3 answers and they're all really high quality and they're all people who know what they're talking about. And so you can refer somebody to that, and it's easy and it's all high quality and it's all right there. Right. So I think that's like really valuable. And I think it's definitely like a step in the right direction. And yeah, like I said, I mean, I have nothing but utmost respect for academics who I am but a wretched sinner, and I I'm nothing compared to you guys the adults who do the real work. Yeah, nothing but respect for all of you. And I hope that that when I am representing your work, like I was in a recent video with talking a lot about Kyle Sellner's work, who's a historian of colonial America who wrote a great book on King Philip's War. I was kind of drawing very primarily from a book of his and stuff. So I hope that in situations like that, where I'm kind of spotlighting academia and academic research, I'm kind of doing it justice and I'm doing a good job. But yeah, so in any case, yeah, I think that it's good that academics make an effort to engage with the public when they can, take time out of their busy schedules, of course, and when they feel like it's a good move for them professionally. I would encourage anybody who's maybe an academic or maybe who just has a history degree, or maybe who, like me, has a different skill set, but has sort of maybe has sort of an indirect kind of path to or a background in historical education. I would say, if you've got the skill set and if you feel like you can do it responsibly, join us. Join us on the front lines of historical education. The internet desperately needs good information, it's. I mean, you often hear people say, well, the internet argument's not going to change anybody's mind about anything. And maybe it won't 9 times out of 10, but sometimes it does. And as thankless as it is and as pessimistic as it certainly made me personally, I'm not going to lie, we need soldiers. We need people on the front, because, we've seen that, kooky belief online can come out of the computer and fucking throttle you and storm the Capitol. You know what I mean? So this stuff is quite important. So yeah, I would just say to everybody listening who is an academic, keep up the good fight, and yeah, hope that we can get information out there in a responsible and accurate way.
Well, I think that wraps up most of what we had to talk about. Thank you for joining us and us and our listeners tonight. It was excellent talking to you. It was wonderful to hear your perspective on all the different issues that we talked about. So I'll let you go ahead and just wrap up. If there's any final messages you wanted to leave the audience, if there was anything you wanted to plug coming out, now would be the time to do it. Otherwise, I hand it off to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and like I said, I'm a big fan of the subreddit, and I think you mods do a great job. And if you want to check out my stuff and you don't know who I am, my YouTube channel is Atun-Shei Films. You can also find it if you search Checkmate Lincolnites, which is my most popular series. I've got a film coming out called The Sudbury Devil that should be screening, hopefully in a theater near you, in some indie theaters later this year. Maybe, not likely, but if at least if you're in Boston, New York, or New Orleans, there will definitely be a screening near you. Hopefully in more places than that as well. And it should be streaming not too terribly long after that. Fingers crossed. So I would just encourage you to check out my work, and hopefully you will enjoy it. And if you don't, eat my shit. Thank you, Thomas, so much. And this was a ton of fun.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.